Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started timely. My name is Sasha Beatty, and I am with the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for Trauma-Informed Communication for Prosecutors. We have a great program ahead, so we're looking forward to it. A few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. You are muted on entry, so if you have a question for our guests, please use the Q&A box to submit any questions, which we'll hold until the end of the webinar to ask them. This session is also being recorded, so the recording and the slides will be sent to the registrants and also uploaded to our membership portal. This program has also been approved presumptively for 1 hour of general California MCLE credit. So if you're in another jurisdiction besides California, you'll receive a certificate of completion, which you can use to self-report. And finally, our disclaimer, although APA is taking part in hosting today's webinar, the opinions expressed by those of the individual speaking do not necessarily reflect the views of the association. And lastly, just a quick plug, just keep an eye out for a couple more of our webinars down the line. We have an AI webinar on August 18th, which goes through how to use AI when evaluating or when processing discovery and how to make your sort of workload a little cleaner, easier to use. We have the Take It Down Law overview on August 25th. We have a domestic violence and pregnancy and access to reproductive health care on September 8th. And then we have HIPAA for prosecutors on September 30th. Finally, we'll also be doing a few future webinars with Cordelia and her team, which is super exciting, so stay tuned. Now, let me introduce our speaker. Today's presenter is Cordelia Coppelson, Director of Training and an Assistant State's Attorney with the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, which is one of the 2 largest prosecutors' offices in the country. Cordelia is a career prosecutor with 30 years of experience in criminal litigation, law enforcement training, and prosecutor professional development. As Director of Training, she oversees onboarding, mentorship, leadership development, and professional education for more than 1,300 prosecutors and staff. Before returning to Cook County, she served as a Bureau Chief of Law Enforcement Training at the Illinois Attorney General's Office, training thousands of prosecutors, officers, and investigators statewide on trauma-informed investigation and prosecution, the neurobiology of trauma, and victim-centered communication. She's also developed statewide training curricula and served on several state commissions and task forces, including as co-chair of the SASETA Implementation Task Force. So Cordelia, thank you so much for being here, and I'll just turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sasha. Welcome, everybody. As Sasha told you, my name's Cordelia Coppelson, and we will jump into this. Trauma-informed communication is one of my favorite subjects. We've been training on it since 2017, and it has changed, and there's been some bigger changes in how we look at trauma-informed prosecution. So there are new slides this go around as the language has changed a wee bit, so we'll talk more about that. But what I really do like about this is that this applies to every single victim, every single witness of any violent crime that you try. There is no one who is untouched by the experience of either witnessing or being the victim of violent crime. And I think that we are really working now that it has been 30, I took the bar 30 years ago, July. So I think so much has changed in how we approach our victims, how we approach our interviews with our victims, our ability to give victims autonomy and power, try and give them some of their power and their control back. And so we are going to dive into it since I only have you for this hour. So let's get started, shall we? Just like background, right? I come from I'm born and raised in Chicago. We're 5.1 million people in Cook County, 2.7 million people in the city of Chicago. We are bigger than 28 states by population, and it is a gigantic undertaking. For example, but I do want to show you this picture because I do also want to make a plug for Chicago. It is the most beautiful city you could ever go to between the months of April and October, and then you're sort of on your own if you decide to come here in the winter because it's pretty dire. But we're also going to make one more shameless plug that you should come see our new presidential library, home to an amazing campus and it's only a couple blocks from where I grew up. So back to that. We have a large office, and we are, just to give you an idea, we're onboarding 95 new lawyers coming up in 2 weeks. This is just to let you know how big the work is that we do here, but it's also it's harder when we have so many cases and so many lawyers to make sure that we're on the same page when it comes to our approach to trauma-informed communication. So we work really hard to make sure that our people understand what it is we're doing. And so what we'll be covering today is part one will be understanding trauma, getting an idea of what your brain does, what isn't a choice in what you do in these difficult situations. Part two will talk about the lasting impact, long-term effects, childhood adversity, all of that. And then we will finally, we will be discussing the trauma-informed interview, which really is the most important part of the whole thing that we want to make sure we're getting right, is to make sure that we are not doing more harm. So we will keep going. I'm not going to do the learning objectives. You're going to get smarter, hopefully, if I do my job. So we're going to start with what is trauma, right? So trauma is the exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence that was directly experienced, witnessed, or learned of. We want to think about why it matters. We want to be thinking that every single victim we meet has experienced some form of trauma or had this traumatic experience. So you're not just talking to a witness who happens to be upset. You are talking to a brain that was operating in survival mode. So we really want to start talking about the different kinds of trauma that we can see, that we're better versed in figuring out what kind of trauma we think someone is experiencing. We do not diagnose people. That is not our jobs. We do not give therapy. We do not give, we don't give any kind of medical advice. We make sure that those people, if they are in need of more support, are given the appropriate referrals. But it is really important for us as we prepare our people to testify that we have some understanding. So we're going to think about all the different kinds of trauma that there is. There's secondary trauma. That's the trauma that we see. Secondary vicarious trauma. That's trauma by absorption. You see it in police personnel, emergency department personnel, firefighters, paramedics. There are people that go out on a call, and even though they may have no relation to the call whatsoever, they are changed by it, right? Then we have historical trauma. That can be trauma that's carried across generations of people. That could be seen as larger. I like to watch those hoarding shows, mostly because it makes me feel better about the way my house looks. But if you see a hoarding show and there's a guy who grew up in the 1930s and he had like 300 cans of expired food, but he refuses to throw it out. What's the historical background to that, right? It's probably the Great Depression, right? And he's probably somebody who grew up hungry. And the idea of getting rid of that food is not acceptable to him because of the experiences that he has had. So that's something to think about. In that case, cultural can be the assault on a community's identity. Cultural trauma can be seen as the long-lasting impacts of slavery in our country or the Holocaust. That this is just giant impacts on groups of people. And then finally, institutional trauma, which is pretty interesting if we think about it. Institutional trauma, there can be a higher uptick in post-traumatic stress disorder based on the fact that institutional is, it can be child protective services, the military, prison. It is, you are being told you have to go somewhere, but we will make a promise to you that you will be safe. And then something bad happens to you. Then you have more trauma as a result because you told me I would be okay. Even our criminal justice system can be seen on that line, on those lines of institutional trauma. So that's something to keep in mind as well. When we think about this, I love this quote. I think this quote is something all of us should be aware of. It's the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to walk through water without getting wet. We are absolutely fooling ourselves if we think that we don't have the trauma that we see in our day-to-day life, especially those of us that work in felony violent crimes, crimes against children, crimes, sexual crimes. All of them have that long-lasting impact that you can see. So we're going to talk about the neurobiology of trauma, and it's kind of a twofold that I want us to be thinking about. First, how the brains and bodies respond to acute, stressful, and traumatic events such as sexual assault as they are happening, and in the alternative, how these experiences, these extreme experiences, are encoded and stored and potentially retrieved from memory. So we do want to be aware of that twofold that we'll be working on. And then we want to always remember that an understanding of trauma, including the type of trauma endured and how it affects a person's physical and mental health, is something that's important for all of us. That trauma awareness also includes an understanding of that secondary traumatic stress or the emotional duress that results when an individual hears and copes about the effects of other people's trauma. So we are trying really hard, and I think we're doing a better job of really thinking about that bigger picture of trauma awareness. Now, the next thing that is important to think about is also the type of trauma when we talk about it as a private trauma or we talk about it as a shared trauma. 9/11 is the example that I give for us to think about what shared trauma is. It can be kind of difficult for me. I do teach at our police academies, and it makes me feel really old because the majority of those people in our police academies don't remember 9/11 or were too young. And there are a couple of them now that weren't born during 9/11 by September 11th, 2001. So it is sort of interesting. But to think about shared trauma, you think about what happened after 9/11. We talked to each other, right? You talked to your dry cleaner, you talked to the lady at the grocery store, you talked to your family members, you talked to your pastor, you talked to your coworkers, and everyone talked, and everyone would say pretty much the same thing, how devastated they were for those people that lost their lives and their families, how scared they were for this giant act of terror to happen in America, how scared they are for the future of our country. Is something like this going to happen again? And you see these people exchanging this information, and it really does make a big difference because it's shared, right? It's a shared burden. But I know that I feel the same way as the lady at the grocery store, as my coworker, as my parents do. And it helps, right? Because people are mirroring back to us what we are feeling and making us understand that our feelings are completely valid, right? But you take private trauma. Let's say you have a boy who is sexually assaulted by an uncle, and he never tells anybody ever, right? And he grows up feeling really conflicted about how much he loved this uncle and how much he loved the attention, but how much he feels shame because he knows that it wasn't, what had been done to him wasn't okay. But he feels like very dirty because nobody else has those feelings because he's never told anybody else. And so he lives with that conflict, feeling ashamed, feeling dirty, feeling that holding on to that trauma, and it's his and it's private. And really you think to yourself, gosh, all that person would need to do is go to a support group of sexual assault survivors and hear other stories and hear mirroring stories that they felt that way. Or once he shared that story, that somebody else said, oh my gosh, I feel like everybody has that moment. To hear that everybody else has that moment is huge, right? But to live with that shame and that trauma alone is difficult. So it's always interesting to see sort of on what scale does this happen and where is your victim in that space as well. We always want to think about what we see when we talk about what we see in trauma in people. Our physical, and this could be one of these things, all of these things, none of these things. Everybody's going to have a different reaction, right? So those physical reactions, nausea, soreness, headaches, fatigue, sleep disturbances, startle responses, GI and other kinds of problems, right? And then there's psychological reactions, right? Fear, anxiety, self-blame, nightmares, confusion, powerlessness, guilt, anger, shame, difficulty concentrating. Again, some of these things, all of these things, none of these things, every person is different in the way that they respond to trauma. And then we're going to think about indicators of trauma in people. How do we see those people, right? Everyday life can be overwhelming, right? There's a strong psychological or physical reaction to everyday stress. There is issues of self-harm, shame, self-blaming, suicidal thoughts. There are also inappropriate responses. And this is, I think, where things can start to get dicey if you're not trauma informed. And this goes for our law enforcement, for our first responders, and for us as prosecutors meeting these people in these spaces. And they're laughing or smiling during an event or interview, right? We don't like that, right? They're telling you the worst thing ever, but they're have a smile or a little lilt to their voice, right? Or in the alternative, they're detached, little or no emotion, right? They're telling you the worst thing that you've ever heard, but they're telling you like it's their shopping list, right? Their grocery list, right? And we don't like that. We don't like it because we're used to what comes out of the mouth matches the face and the story, right? We want to see all of that. For any of you that think about it, it's really interesting. Think about, I usually push this off to a question to law enforcement. During COVID, doing a traffic stop with half of your face covered was difficult, right? People can't see your smile. People can't see that you're professional. All they're relying on are your eyes. How about someone looking at someone in a car trying to evaluate their danger as a police officer? I can't see their face. I can't see if they're smiling. It takes out a huge amount of area that we use to make judgment calls, right? Because we're looking for micro expressions. We're looking for all of the little things that can tell us that what we can take from this person, right? And so part of that is when we get those really detached responses or that laughing and smiling, we just think it doesn't go, right? It doesn't match. And that can be really difficult for us. And finally, self-medicating with drugs and alcohol is the age-old approach to trauma. And it does not help, but it is an easy backup to try and manage a lot of that emotion, unfortunately. We're going to stick to 3 parts of the brain, right? We're going to talk about the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala, right? So your prefrontal cortex, it's your watchtower, it's your big brain. The ordinary role of that is rational thought, planning, staying calm. And we want to remember that the prefrontal cortex under pressure isn't there, right? It takes the back seat, right? And then you also want to think about your hippocampus. Think about your hippocampus. It's like the most type A person that you know without trauma, right? I'll take the memory, I put it in the file cabinet. I take the next memory, I put it in the file cabinet. And these are all autobiographical memories, and they all go in order, and they're beautifully linear, right? And then finally, you have your amygdala. I always think about your amygdala as a guy named Bubba, and Bubba sits on your shoulder, and all day long, Bubba's only job is, are we safe? Are we safe? Are we safe, right? So that's all it does. And then when it gets activated, right, and you just remember, it's an almond-sized portion of your brain. When it gets activated, all of a sudden, it looks at the prefrontal cortex and says, hold my beer, right? Your big brain is out, and you're just acting on your amygdala. So another way to think about it is your big brain is the prefrontal cortex, and your hippocampus is your organizer or your filing clerk, right? And it's going to process the information we see, hear, feel, taste, and touch into memories, and it helps us store organize and store those long-term memories, right? And it gives us the file stamp. The problem is the hormone flood can take place before the individual is even aware of the danger. And when I say hormone flood, what I mean is this. The amygdala detects brain danger. This is why the brain is so interesting, right? The amygdala detects that threat, and all of a sudden there's a giant flood of hormones in your brain. And let's think about those different hormones and how they affect it, right? So you have adrenaline, right? It will give more, it'll give you blood, it'll give you power, it'll give you so that it's a big stress response for your heart, breath, and it sounds the alarm, right? And then it's cortisol, right? And cortisol will put will put blood into your arms and legs, right? And it takes blood from the big brain. And then opioids, right? It's a natural painkiller. It can also produce frozen fight. I mean, it's got opioid in the title, right? And people, you've heard about it. You've heard about it in a bad car crash, right? A police officer can walk up to this guy. He's been T-boned by a giant truck, and the guy's sitting there, and the police officer says, "Hey, dude, are you all right?" And the guy's like, "Yeah, I'm all right. I was at the light. I went through the light. The guy came out of nowhere and just T-boned me." And the police officer's looking down, and the guy's got his femur sticking out of his jeans. And the guy isn't taking on board that he has the femur sticking out of his jeans, right? You hear about it in these people. There was the movie about the hiker who fell into the crevice and he had to cut off his own arm and then hike 6 miles to get help for himself. That's your opioids, right? That's your body saying, you can't handle what's happening right now, so we're gonna just give you that. And then oxytocin. Oxytocin's another really good, interesting one. A lot of people refer to it as just a way your body's trying to trick you into the fact that you're feeling better. And that you can think about the oxytocin. Some people call it God's grace. If you've ever seen anyone pass into death and people say they would look so peaceful, they had a smile on their face, they seemed so at ease. That's your brain's last burst of trying to make sure that you're not afraid. And it's a great gift, all of these different hormones as they dump onto the brain. Now, this is where the new part of my presentation, which it still throws me because I'm so used to moving right into fight, flight, and freeze. And the fight and flight model is really kind of being looked at differently, because the truth of the matter is fight and flight are actually not things that people do that often in these situations. Freeze we are going to talk about, and freeze is definitely something that still exists, and it's in trouble. It's an important thing to think about. But the person who came up with fight and flight, he really studied physiology, not behavior. So it's really never was about what the people did, but what was going on in the brain. And for example, most people don't fight or flee while being sexually assaulted. And it's another issue that our jurors are going to think that fight and flee are normal, and our victims who don't do either are blamed or did not suffer harm. Fawn was also in the play. For those of you who have been in this trauma space, fawn was another one that was sort of added in. Now, fawn's an interesting one because it really it says, do you fawn over someone, right? Does that mean you're showing affection? And the fact is that there is some portion of that when you see people being very polite, but that's more of a default. We'll talk about that on the next slide as well. So fawn isn't really something that we try and think about anymore. The new reframe on this now is that physiology is not behavior. So it's physiology is the survival mode, and behavior are the reflexes and habits as a result. So it's what the first part of that is going to be, what does the body system do? Tunnel vision, auditory exclusion, fast breathing, racing, crashing hearts, muscle tensing, going limp. That's the physiology of what the actual survival mode looks like. And then the behavior is going to be reflex and habit. What the person does, the reflex is wired in by evolution, and habit learned over your lifetime, right? So like one of the ways they like to describe it is the dashboard versus what actually is happening in the driving, right? So your survival mode is your dashboard, right? The warning lights in of the body switch on, but reflex and habit are the driving, what the person actually does with the car, right? So a red temperature light doesn't tell you where the car went. It just means that we had a problem with the car, right? So that's the same thing. The body, like knowing the body was flooded with stress hormones does not predict exactly what that person is going to do, because we don't know that part yet. We don't know what that person is going to do. So the physiology is really well accepted of what we have seen, but how each individual responds is something that is going to be different. But freezing is one that I think, I don't think freezing is one that I think we talk about enough. And I want you to be thinking about freezing a lot. There's detection freezing. That's that everything stops. The rabbit that senses the predator, it holds everything down and it scans. It's the reflective first response. And then we have shocked freezing, right? Which is more usually in a situation, I have a drop-down menu of things that I would do here if my big brain was still working. But since my big brain is offline, that drop-down menu is blank. I don't know what to do. And you hear that from your victims. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there. I didn't turn. I didn't shield myself. I didn't get small. I just stood there and said, "Excuse me?" Right? That's an idiotic thing to do while you're being robbed. Excuse me? But that's what my body chose to do, right? So that's like, there's no behavior options to choose from. And then there's no good choices. Because the only choices are between extremely passive or reactive behaviors, and none of them seem good or right to the person at the time, right? This is the one where the idea of saying, "Oh, I'm going to play dead," right? That all sounds good in theory, but to actually do that, or to say what you're supposed to do is try and poke somebody's eyes out, which is great. But have you ever actually tried to do it, right? I mean, these are what we're asking people to do and figure out is really very difficult. And we really want to be thinking like detection freezing is the rabbit that goes stone still the instant they smell the fox, right? You stop everything, hold the brake, and scan. It's not a decision. It's one of the oldest survival reflexes out there, and we have it too, right? So again, remember, when the victim tells you, "I just froze," it's an honest, literal, neurological truth of that first moment. I didn't, and then it's the next part could be, "I didn't know what to do next," right? So we're going to talk about these extreme survival reflexes too. And again, these are really important, and I don't think we talk about them enough because, right, that tonic immobility, paralysis, can't move, can't speak, the muscles are rigid, the breathing increases, the eyes might close. We don't talk about like that tonic immobility enough, I think. And you want to think about situations. I think we should always remember that we work off of scenarios, right? Even though our law enforcement officers are very scenario based in their training and we are not, it is the same thing that in life we are. If you hear something on the news and you always say, "If that happened to me, I would do this," right? "If that was happening to me, I would do this." Now, usually we also write ourselves the hero in the situation, not the person that stands there and does nothing, right? So we always say, "This is what I would do. This is what I would do." So let's say you have that. And in Chicago right now, we have, let's say we have a slew of robberies on the west side of the city, right? And they're being done by 14, 15-year-old boys, right? And there you have a guy, he's 40 years old, he's fit, and he works his regular job and gets paid his money for doing his job. And he says, "You know what? No, that's not going to happen to me. If someone was to come up here and try and rob me with a gun, I would disarm him. I'd tune him up real quick. And then I'll call the cops and let them handle it. But I'm going to teach this child a lesson. I will not be punked by a child," right? And that's his scenario. That's what he's got running the whole time. So fast forward, unfortunately, the day comes, the kid sticks the gun in the man's face. He urinates down the side of his leg and passively hands over his wallet. First question, is that person even going to call the police, right? The answer may be no, because I'm embarrassed, because I'm gonna have to explain to them why my pants are wet, right? Second, he didn't do what he was supposed to do, right? He had it in his mind that he was going to be the hero in this situation. And in his opinion, he was not. So he's already self-blaming at that point, right? I think it's one of the reasons why we have victims or witnesses to crime who do not tell the truth. It's not because they want the wrong person convicted. It's not because they're trying to get in the way of law enforcement solving the crime. It's because I cannot admit to anyone the level that I feel I was a coward. right? You have a mom and pop store and there's no video, right? And Pop has said, we've been married for 40 years. If Ma was ever to be in danger, I would save the day. I would take a bullet for this woman. I love her so much, right? And again, the day comes, they get robbed, and Pop hits the ground in the fetal position. Is he ever going to actually tell the truth to anyone that he didn't see what happened, right? Because he was too busy curled up on the floor in a ball. The answer is no, I think, right? But the problem is going to be that he has to make something up, and maybe what he says is going to match blood spatter. What he says isn't going to match the ME's report on the direction of the bullet or the direction of the path of the bullet, whatever it may be, right? So it's really important for us to explain and educate to a certain extent that your body chose, and your body's only choice, the only thing your body doesn't care if you make an idiot of yourself. Your body doesn't care if you look like a coward. Your body's only choice is that you're alive at the end of this horrific experience, right? So we're going to do whatever it takes to get to alive. So we have to remember when that man is sitting across from us, hopefully in a dry pair of pants, and we're talking about his armed robbery, we have to remind him that his body chose correctly, because I'm sitting here talking to you. I'm sitting here having this conversation with you. If you're sitting here alive, your body chose the right way. Because how else do we know from our experience as prosecutors that that case can end, right? He reaches for that gun, that kid shoots him in the head, and he's dead before he hits the ground. That's the other scenario. And if that's always going to be a possibility, did his body pick a good path? The answer is yes. And we're just happy that this man is still alive. And we have to remind him of that his body was actually quite heroic, because the only goal was to keep him alive. Then we have collapsed immobility, which we will talk about, the heart rate and blood pressure crash. That's fainting, sleepiness, possible loss of consciousness, right? It's a different mechanism altogether from tonic immobility. And then you have disassociation, where you hear people that they blank out, they space out, they feel disconnected from their body, that they feel like they're running on autopilot. You have some people say that they feel like they were like watching from above or watching from the side what happened. And it can be really interesting to hear. Now, collapsed immobility, we're going to watch this video. There is some swearing, so it's been bleeped out because this is a national prosecuting thing that we're having conversations. I'm trying to show you that I'm a professional, but I do really I picked this video for this man on the catapult. One, the catapult does not help him at all. Or I'm sorry, the Superman shirt doesn't help this man at all. But secondly, I want you to listen to what he says before the catapult goes off. And then we'll talk about it I will talk about it afterwards. Oh. The volume is not going. Can you guys hear it?
It's coming through, Cordelia. Yes, it's sounding good.
Oh. Oh, I know why. Hold on, everybody. Give me 1 second. I actually can solve my own problem, which kind of makes me sort of proud of myself. I'm not going to lie. Here we go. I was annoyed that my thing was beeping and letting me know that I was getting Teams messages. Look at this. I figured it out myself. So proud. All right, so we'll go back. Sorry, everybody. We'll just go back so we can listen to the whole thing. And I think we are good to go. Yay.
Yeah, I ain't scared of rats. This ain't nothing. Like the one we was in Grady Middle, that ain't nothing. I was young, I was supposed to, I'm delicious from all that. I don't cuss that all the time. Well, I still cuss every now and again, but I ain't gonna cuss today. I know this rat ain't nothing. Right. You know, I made it all the way through. I've always been one to make it all the way through. I've done it all the time. What? Oh, prayed a little bit.
So he prayed a little bit, right? I think what I would say though is it's a really good example because did you hear what he was saying before the catapult went off? I always make it through. I make it through. I always make it through. I would bet $1,000 that he has passed out on these rides before, but he's sitting next to the girl and the woman, and he's like, oh, just don't like his own internal dialogue is don't pass out, don't pass out. Whatever you do, don't pass out, right? And then what did his body say? His body was like, oh, it's so cute. You thought you were going to pick. Boom, you're out, right? Like he was actively trying to not pass out. And it turned out that that wasn't going to work for him because his body was wired to do something different, right? So that's, I think, an interesting way to be looking at it because we want to think about the fact that habit behaviors are cultural software on biological hardware, right? So depending on how we grew up, those are our habit behaviors. We've been brought up to be polite. We have been brought up to be kind. We have been brought up to do all of these other things that we're not trained to be Rambo. We're not trained to be Jack Reacher. We aren't those people because that's not how we were trained because we didn't need to know any of those things. So because people don't have self-defense training, right? They don't, your habits that surface are passive or ineffective. Face saving, submission, right? Nice girl socialization learned over a lifetime is a really good example of that. And I think this one was the survivor explained their behavior in words that sound like weakness if you don't understand habit behavior. I didn't kick or scream or push. I wanted not to cause a conflict, right? I don't want it to get worse. So how do I keep it as small as possible, right? I tried to be as polite as possible. I did not want to offend him, right? That's that habit that we come back to, right? And it's not that there was no harm caused. It was someone trying to minimize what was happening to them. So we have to be thinking about that super encoding, what we're looking at, central versus peripheral detail, the idea of a spotlight. You guys are going to get a handout of all of this too. So there's some great analogies in here. Again, talking about why it's very obvious in the first couple minutes of detail, and then it sort of they get a little bit more spotty. And then we want to be thinking about the central versus peripheral details. Think about it as a spotlight in the dark theater. The brain aims a single spotlight at whatever matters for survival, right? And it lands on only things that are lit brightly enough to remember. So we can't, asking what the person wore or describing something that's not in that flashlight, I can't tell you about, right? So we're going to be thinking about that because that's a real issue with our sensory processing, because thoughts processed without trauma are very linear, right? They make sense. And then we think about, and remember I told you, figure out your most type A person when you think about someone who would love to be your hippocampus. Well, now your hippocampus after trauma looks like this. And get rid of your most type A person. Imagine a meth head who hasn't slept for 6 days. That's who is running your hippocampus now because of trauma. The memories are just getting jammed in there willy-nilly with no help, right? So we really want to be aware of that. We want to think about how that trauma is stored. It's now stored in pieces, right? It's not linear. It's out of sequence. It can be jumbled. I think one of the best examples that I heard at one of the trainings I went to was, think about if you like to do puzzles, right? If you can do a puzzle, you love puzzling. I am a puzzler. And by the way, puzzling is a form of meditation and self-care, which I did not know. And, but it's a very interesting one. So you puzzle, right? And you're good at puzzling. What would happen if I took the picture, right? The cover of the box, and I took it with, could you still put that puzzle together? The answer is yes, but it's going to be a lot harder, right? Yeah, I could find the 4 corners, then I'm going to find the edges, then I'm going to group the colors and be like, oh, there's a panda. Oh, there's a beach ball. But the process is going to be a lot longer. Sometimes when people have experienced traumatic events, that's what those interviews are going to feel like, that you have all the pieces, but you don't have the picture. And that's where we're really going to be trying to work on it, Because what happens when the victim is not able to explain the event in a complete and logical sequence? How does law enforcement like to ask their questions? What happened next? What happened next? What happened next? What happened next? What happens if you can't answer what happened next? What happened next? It's kind of twofold. I think sometimes it is the person isn't telling the truth. But secondly, is it this person has no value, right? They're not giving me anything of evidentiary value. And the fact is, the person could have things of evidentiary value or could have things that could be easily corroborated, but we haven't asked the right questions and we haven't allowed that person to give us all of that information because it's coming out in that jumbled kind of sequence, non-sequence, right? So we want to remember that they're kind of losing their sense of self, that they don't have they might not be able to participate in the investigation in a rational manner. They also may have problems with present and past, or relevant and irrelevant. You know, if you've been at this job long enough, you know relevant, irrelevant, right? You ask what color the car is, and all of a sudden that person is telling you what happened 3 weeks ago at the Target when they saw the offender's girlfriend's cousin wearing an ugly green dress, and you're like, how do we get here? Like, that's not my question. But it's important to see where that person goes with the questions that you're asking, because that may be somewhere that you didn't know you needed to go to get what you need. And then past and present, right? We have to think about the victim may not be able to differentiate. So when you ask them where they were that night, I started at Kenny's, and then I went to Rafferty's, and then I ended up at Joe's Saloon. They can't tell you that, right? And this is, something that we really want to be aware of. And again, we want to think, and this is a great quote by Dr. Lisak, to participate in that process, to endlessly recount that trauma where the perpetrator sits, like literally in the courtroom, right, is equivalent to the zebra consciously choosing to return to the water hole where the lion attacked, right? We are asking them to go against instinct about these dangerous things that happen to them, to ask them to involve themselves in in the court system, right? Now we're going to watch this video. This video involves an officer-involved shooting. The officer does not die, but it is not without violence. If you are not comfortable watching it, you do not have to. But I would like to point out a couple of things in this video that's very interesting for our conversation today.
On an October night in Miami, Dominic Jean tried setting fire to an 8,000-gallon underground storage tank at this gas station next to Miami's International Airport. Surveillance footage shows the smoke smoldering as Jean grabs a gas pump and starts dousing the ground.
It scared me because I thought, wow, we're going to die.
That's Miami-Dade County Police Officer Mario Gutierrez, who happened to be patrolling the area, racing in, jumps out of his car, hits the emergency shutoff to the gas pumps, then finds himself standing over a simmering time bomb, unsure if the gas tanks would explode.
There would have been a massive chaos. And they would have thought it was terrorism. Who knows? They wouldn't have been able to talk to me because I would have been nothing but vaporized.
Gutierrez tries stopping Dominic Jean with a taser, but it didn't work. Jean starts wildly trying to stab Gutierrez with a knife and a screwdriver.
It came from my throat, and I blocked it.
Gutierrez falls to the ground. Jean viciously swings at him more than 20 times.
That was a fight to the death, and only one person was going to walk away from that.
Gutierrez is stabbed about a dozen times, but he's able to briefly kick the man off just long enough to grab his gun, firing 5 times, killing Jean on the spot.
I never heard the gunshots. Never heard them. All I heard was the clinking of the shell casings hitting the ground.
It all lasted less than 30 seconds, but dealing with the emotions hasn't always been easy.
I felt like I failed. I was. I need to know that I put up a fight, that I fought this guy, because I didn't remember. I had no recollection of it.
I think this is a real important thing to think about when we talk about trauma, because first of all, first question, good shoot, bad shoot, right? Obviously we have a good shoot, stabbed 12 times, right? Why do we have an adult man crying about a good shoot on national television, right? Because he does not remember taking somebody else's life, right? And harken back to before when there weren't necessarily videos. who was he going to, what could he rely on to make the determination of what is out there, like what happened that night? The high store clerk, right? He comes out and he says, I saw you, I saw the guy, and I saw you shoot the guy. That's not helpful, right? That's terrifying. So first of all, he has no recollection except for, and this is a really interesting sensory fragment, right? When we talk about those puzzle pieces, when we talk about the fact that the hippocampus is now just jamming memories, he does have some memories, and you can tell because he's owned those memories himself. And one of them is a really interesting sensory memory, right? This is where it would be lovely if it was interactive because you guys could tell me what you think, but it's the clinking in of the shell casings, right? Those of you that ever fired a weapon, firing the weapon is way louder, right? The ejecting of the shell casing is nothing, right? But that's what his mind held onto. That was this tiny sensory memory that you can tell is incredibly important to him as he brings it up in the interview. So that's another one where I think that we have this ability to understand these things in terms of law enforcement and these dangerous spaces that they get themselves in, but we don't necessarily give that same grace to our victims or our witnesses, right? We also want to remember that there are witnesses to crime that, you know, they witness a horrible car accident where someone gets hit by a car and a leg goes one way and a body goes the other. Cops are in that space and EMS is in that space for their profession. The lady that was at the light who was on her way to book club is not in that position. So even though she didn't know the person, she wasn't involved in the accident, she simply observed it, it's still going to be quite a traumatic event for her. So I want us to be thinking about that as well. Okay, we're going to keep going because I want to make sure that we hit all of the slides. But I think this is important. As part of its legacy, trauma leaves its victims with fear networks etched in the amygdala. Networks that can be triggered by multiple cues that would not ordinarily evoke fear. Trauma also leaves its victims with fragmented and discontinued memories of what happened to them. And as a consequence of those legacies, the victim faces enormous challenges in the judicial process, right? And we want to think about that, right? Like, again, with that trigger, because we talk about triggers a lot in the world right now. And this is where we really do have to remember that our victims suffer from these triggers. Let's go back to, let's say you have a girl sexually assaulted by her uncle from the ages of 5 through 12. And he would come into her bedroom at night. He wore too much, let's pick a Axe cologne, right? So every night she'd hear the door open, she'd smell the Axe cologne, and she would be assaulted, right? And this went on. She never told anyone, never shared her trauma with anyone. She goes on whatever the kids are on these days, Hinge, Bumble, something, and she swipes right. She meets a nice guy. He comes to pick her up at her house. She opens the door, and his Axe cologne hits her. She slams the door and throws up on the floor, right? Axe isn't the worst cologne out there. It's not ranking like great, but it's not going to make you throw up unless, what do? Your trigger is that smell of that cologne is so strongly linked to that assault. So that's something we really do want to be thinking about. So we think about the long lasting impact of trauma. We have dysregulation, hypervigilance, preoccupation, alexithymia, distrust, shame, right? We can see this. We also want to remember how different people with different, if you haven't done any work and thought about any ACE or understood what ACE scores are, we can do another presentation on that. That is a great, very interesting space to understand what happens to someone from 0 to 18. If they have an ACE score that is high, that means bad things happened to them while they were a child. Then how they deal with trauma later on in life is something that we can also be thinking about. The next thing we also want to be thinking about is when we want to say, oh my God, what's wrong with you, right? We talk to people from all different walks of life, and sometimes you're just like, I don't understand why you are who you are, right? And you really, it's not some of our better moments, but it is what happens, right? So we want to think about what happens. But instead of asking what's wrong with you, maybe you could just ask what happened to you, right? That's just giving the person some grace, right? We're going to be paying attention to how they got where they are, because we can do as much harm as good if we're not working from that trauma lens, right? So here we are. Oh,
And Cordelia, we have about 10 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It's a picture of me. I am currently on the 11th floor of that building on the left side of your screen, which during our tornadoes the other day, this building was moving back and forth. Not fun. But what we want to think about is, now that we know about trauma and trauma in the brain, how does it affect the rest of the process for us? And I think this quote says it all. If one set out by design to devise a system for provoking intrusive post-traumatic symptoms, one could do no better than a court of law. And we really want to be thinking about, we're not saying that the courtroom is unjust. What we're saying is that it is very difficult for our victims and our witnesses to come in and talk about it again. So we have to think about how we're going to prepare ourselves for that interview. We've got to be prepared for whatever might be said. We have to Botox it. The person has to give us the information, right? And they have to know that they can trust us to give us the information. If we look like we can't handle the information, or we find it troubling, disturbing, outside the norm, weird, they will not give us the information. So we really are going to have to be open to listening and not judging. We want to remember that it's the victim's interview, not the interviewers. We have to set aside a reasonable amount of time so that there's no feel for a rush. That means no phone in front of you. If you are an Apple Watch user, I would take off the watch and leave it somewhere else, because when the texts come through and you're looking at your phone every 5 seconds, what's that person thinking? You don't have time for them, right? So we're going to be thinking about how we shape that trauma-informed interview. We have to prepare. We have to be ready for them. We want to open first with empathy, and then we're going to have our questions. We're going to give them a chance to narrate what happened. Then we're going to have the opportunity to clarify what's going on, and then we're going to close, right? We're going to close with our thank you and our safety and our next steps. So again, I want you to be reading every report, talk to the responding officer, review evidence, listen to the 911 audios, right? Especially if they're calls from the house, if they're calls from the witness, a witness to the crime, a victim. You've had 911 calls. We had one where it was the child trying to explain to the dispatch that her father was killing her mother. And so it's really, and then you have to go interview this person. We want to be able to talk to them and know what was going on. We're going to set our conditions, learn about our backgrounds, but we don't want to be hearing the case for the first time, like from the victim's account. We want to know what's happened so that we don't have to make them explain things to us if we don't have to. We're opening with empathy, right? I'm sorry that this happened to you. I'm sorry we're meeting this way. Thank you for trusting me with this information goes so far. This is private. Even if it happened in public, even if it's a murder, a carjacking, it's still a very private, embarrassing, personal situation of something that happened to me as the victim. I suffered disempowerment. I suffered a dehumanization, right? So it's really, I understand this process is difficult. Some of my questions may feel strange. I'll explain why. There are no wrong answers. Again, it's okay not to remember everything. Remember things later, no matter what. You're okay to feel however you feel. There are no right answers to that. Do not promise anything. Do not guarantee anything to any of your victims or your witnesses, especially in terms of confidentiality. There are things we can control, and then there are things that we can't, and make sure they understand and address their concerns. So we're going to get in there and we're going to have those conversations. It's okay to say out loud, I don't know, I don't remember, I'm not ready to talk about that, right? We're going to be allowing for that uninterrupted narrative. Let them tell it all the way through before you ask anything. Try to be patient. Try to reassure them, right? A witness who thinks they are failing will give you what they think you want to hear, right? We want to hear what happened, because we are going to want to make sure that our evidence, does it correspond and does it corroborate? And how can we help with what we have corroborate what our victim is telling us? Demonstrate active listening. I work on this so much, because I am constantly thinking about my next question, my next question, my next question. I literally have to like pinch myself on my leg under the table while I'm having the conversation to slow myself down, right? Because I'm a very fast talker. My court reporters hate me. But it is harder than it looks. And we have to get into that space where that person is allowed to speak. That's also because I'm going to ask you to be patient, right? Let the narrative breathe, allow for open space, allow silence and gaps. As long as they can feel you active listening, we really are going to do a good job. We're going to avoid firing chronological rapid sequence questions. Don't interrupt to correct something. We can go back to it. We're not going to fill silences. And don't be surprised when they can't remember something. And remember that trauma and deception can look very much the same. So we really are going to want to make sure that we're paying attention to what they're saying and what they're giving us, and not judging what they're saying or what they're giving us. Make sure when we're at that last clarifying, we're really going to try and in the beginning ask those open-ended questions. What are you able to tell me about this? What are you able to tell me about that? And then we're going to follow up. We're going to clarify, like, oh, you mentioned there was a tussle. What do you mean by a tussle, right? And then finally, we're going to get to those close-ended questions, narrow 1 or 2 word answers, like, was the porch light on? And then finally, confirm a known fact when we're going to be leading them. And we're really going to try and keep that to a minimum as we're trying to get the information out from that person, especially in those early conversations that we have with them. And think about the language that we're using. Think first, any why did you questions can be reframed and should be reframed. Because why did you? Every time they hear one of those, why did you do this? Why didn't you run? Well, all I can think of is they look at us and go, they're like, well, no, duh. Yeah, it didn't work out for me. Thanks for pointing it out, Captain Obvious, right? That's all they think. You're judging me for what I didn't do. If I had seen this whole thing play out in hindsight, I would have done a better job too. Thank you so much for your Monday morning quarterbacking, right? So, why didn't you scream or fight back? What was going through your mind when you realized you were in danger, right? Did you say no? What are you able to recall during the incident? We can change all of those questions if we need to, right? So we're really going to be thinking about how we can ask them about those sensory details, what you saw, heard, smell, what you felt physically or emotionally, what can't you get out of your mind? What do you keep coming back to? And then go to what were your feelings before the incident, during the incident, after. Talk about feelings and see what you get from those sensory questions, because they're easier for our person to be able to retrieve, and they can help us with that corroboration. We're going to close with Claire. Claire, I don't know who Claire is, but we could close with her too. We can close with Care. We want to remember that we're going to explain what comes next. We're going to address safety. We're going to tell them that it's okay, that things may come later. It's not a problem if people remember things later. We're going to make sure we're up to date on our contact information. We're going to make sure our victim witness people are in it too and connected with our people as well. Because again, if we think they are suffering, they need help, we don't give the help. We are not the people to give the help, but we're going to make sure we connect them with the people that can help them. And again, thank you for trusting me with this information. There's just nothing that will go more in that situation, because I think this is a great quote, especially when you're dealing with victims. And I know when we talk homicide, I think a lot of this can be conversations with our surviving families of homicide, which is another presentation for another day. That is one of my favorites. But really, they are in the same spot because of the traumatic incident of losing that loved one. But it really is to say the survivor, the person who survived the traumatic experience, the violent crime, the forcible felony, to live in the body of a survivor is to never to be able to leave the scene of the crime. I cannot ignore the fact that I live here, right? I mean, that's it. We really want to be aware of that. So hopefully this was helpful. Sorry, we could do a deeper dive on this too. And we can do more conversations about interview. but I think this is a nice overview of it. There is a handout that you can use for reference. If you want more information, this is my phone number, my email address. I am happy to answer any questions that you have. Sorry, I know if I don't have a live audience, I end up talking way too fast, and I'm sorry about that as well. But that is my information, Sasha. I think that's it. Unless we have questions, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Cordelia. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A box right now, and I know that we are at time, but I do hope that the attendees will make use of your contact information. This was incredibly helpful, and I think so important to provide sort of the context within which we operate when we have these types of interactions, right? This is just such a crucial part of being, caring when you're shepherding these cases. So for everybody joining us, the webinar, like I mentioned at the beginning of this, the recording will be made available on our YouTube channel for a limited time, and then also uploaded to our membership info hub within 3 business days. Feel free to reach out to contact@apainc.org to get a copy of the slide deck or the companion guide. Those are also in the materials tab in this GoToWebinar platform. So if you want to access them now, they're still available for you to download. And finally, your CLE or certificate of completion certificates will be sent electronically to you over the next 2 weeks. So keep an eye on your inboxes for that. And with that, thank you so much, Cordelia, for your valuable insights. We're looking forward to having you on a future webinar. Take care, everybody, and thank you for spending your afternoon with us.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.